The alien queen offered her daughter to Earth before a hall of kneeling empires. And every ruler watching believed the human would reach for the crown, because no one refuses a throne when it is placed within arm's reach. Not a throne of glass in living starlight. Not a throne commanding 900 moons, 7 royal fleets, and the obedience of species who had forgotten what freedom tasted like. Queen Valora of the Luminara Dominion stood beneath the broken banners of her conquered ancestors. Silver blood drying at her temple, her armies exhausted, her enemies at the gates. And beside her stood Princess Seralini, heir of 1 billion oaths. Beautiful enough to make diplomats forget their practiced lies. Proud enough to make generals lower their eyes. She was the last jewel the queen still possessed. So Valora turned to the human envoy in the center of the throne hall and said, "Take my daughter, take my crown, take the dominion as bride price, and in return, let Earth save us." The human did not kneel, did not smile, did not look at the princess as a prize. He only looked at the evacuation map, glowing red behind the throne, where cities burned in neat circles and refugee lines vanished one by one. His name was Commander Elias Marr, though Earth had sent him without armor, without medals, without the warships everyone expected. He wore a dark field coat, weathered boots, and the gray expression of a man who had seen too many royal bargains made over common graves. His left sleeve was pinned at the wrist where a prosthetic hand locked beneath the cuff. His right carried a battered medical satchel instead of a sword. Around him, alien dukes hissed at the insult of his plainness. Priests whispered that humanity had sent a clerk to measure the corpse of the Dominion, and Princess Seralini stared at him with open contempt, because she had been raised among conquerors and saviors, and this human looked like neither. Queen Valora stepped closer, desperation cracking the perfection of her voice. Earth is powerful. Earth is feared. Earth turned the Harrow swarm back at Perseus. Earth broke the Morning Gate. Earth made the Black Armada sign surrender with empty guns. I know what your species can do, Commander Marr, so name your terms. My daughter carries the blood of stars. My crown commands fleets older than your nations. I offer both to you in lawful union. Her words rolled through the hall like sacrament. Nobles bowed deeper, not from reverence, but because they wanted Earth owned by marriage before it became dangerous by choice. Seralini lifted her chin, humiliated but silent. The kind of silence bred by palaces where daughters were trained to become treaties. Elias looked from queen to princess, then back to the burning map, and said no. That single word struck the court harder than any bombardment. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The living chandelier stopped pulsing. The honor guards tightened their claws around their spears. The royal scribes forgot to breathe. Queen Valora's eyes widened as if the human had slapped her. Princess Seralin's face flushed silver with fury. No one had refused her before. Suitors had dueled for the right to stand within 10 paces of her veil. Princes had emptied treasuries. Warlords had burned moons merely to be noticed. Yet this scarred human had dismissed a marriage to her as if declining a cup of poisoned wine. Valora whispered, "You refuse the heir of Luminara," Elias answered. "I refuse ownership disguised as alliance." The queen stiffened. "I offer honor," he said. "You offer your daughter as currency because you believe Earth understands tribute better than help. That is your empire speaking, not your heart." Seralin's hand went to the ceremonial blade at her waist, and several guards moved with her anger. But Elias did not step back. He only added, "Earth did not come here to purchase a woman or wear a crown over people who did not choose us." The insult became scandal. Scandal became threat. And the throne hall erupted. Duke of Vareth shouted that the human should be expelled. Lady Vera declared Earth had shamed the royal blood. The war priest demanded satisfaction for the princess. While General Arakish, whose fleets had lost 3 systems in 11 days, simply stared at Elias as if trying to decide whether refusal was madness or strategy. Queen Valora raised one hand in silence returned by fear, not respect, she asked. "If you will not take the crown, what does Earth demand?" Elias turned toward the map again. Civilian corridors. Command transparency, prisoner lists. Control of orbital hospitals. Access to shipyards for evacuation. and the immediate suspension of noble privilege in rescue priority. The nobles gasped, as if he had demanded their heads. Duke Avareth laughed sharply. "You refuse a crown and ask for servant roots," Elias said. "I ask for the things that keep people alive while crowns debate symbolism." The queen's face became unreadable, and Cyrillini looked at him differently for the first time. Not softer, never softer, but as if he had become less simple to hate. Then the enemy announced itself with fire. The eastern window of the throne hall turned black, not from night, but from the shadow of a carven dreadnought descending through the upper atmosphere. Its hull was a wound of iron plates and bone-white engines, its broadcast drums shaking dust from the ceiling. The carven host had come from dead space 3 months earlier, not to rule the Dominion, but to harvest it. They took cities apart by population value. Soldiers first for trophies, engineers second for forced labor, children last because terror aged better when it learned to walk. Their overlord, Graxol the Unbowed, appeared in the air above the court. A giant with a crown made from broken surrender seals, he smiled when he saw Queen Valora, then laughed when he saw Elias. "Is this Earth's champion? A one-handed mediator with no throne, no bride, and no blade, Valora. You offered him your daughter, and still he refused. Even humans know when a kingdom is already meat." Around the hall, nobles recoiled. Serlin's blade came fully free. Elias simply studied Grexhol's eyes. The delay in the projection, the static in the lower audio band, the map behind the enemy leader, the human, had refused a crown. But he had not refused the war. Graxol gave the Dominion 1 hour to surrender the capital, if the queen yielded. He promised to spare high bloodlines for decorative service if she resisted. He would open the lower city domes and let 80 million civilians freeze beneath the royal palace. The transmission ended with the sound of distant screaming. Carefully included, expertly measured, Queen Valora swayed. And for the first time, Cyrillini moved not as princess, but as daughter. Catching her mother's arm, the court looked to Elias. Not because they trusted him, but because the rejected bargain had left him strangely clean. He had no claim to the crown, no claim to the princess, no visible appetite for their wealth, which meant his next words would not be weighed by greed. Elias asked how many shelters below the capital. General Arekish answered before the queen could command him. 400 primary, 11,000 minor, Elias asked. How many with independent heat if the domes rupture? Orakash hesitated. Less than a third. The nobles began speaking over each other again, demanding fleet strikes, evacuation for royal districts, emergency coronation, ritual vows, anything loud enough to hide the number less than a third. Elias opened his satchel and spread paper maps across the throne steps. Actual paper, stained at the edges, marked with pencil. The court reacted to the old material with disdain, until the palace screens flickered under carven interference and the paper remained stubbornly useful. He pointed at the lower city arteries. The carven are not here for your throne. They are using your throne to control your timing. They want you to choose between palace pride and civilian panic. So we do neither. We move the poor first. Freeze the royal elevators. Seize noble transports. Open the funeral tunnels. And turn every ceremonial heat tower into a shelter furnace. Duke Avareth roared, "You cannot seize noble property." Elias looked at Queen Valora. "I cannot. She can." The queen stared at the map. Then at the nobles, at her daughter. At the human who had refused to own her blood and now demanded she spend her privilege like fuel. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. By emergency crown right, all transports serve evacuation. All noble shields serve public shelter. All private guards report to relief command. The old empire gasped. Because its queen had just chosen strangers over lineage. Cyrillini turned on Elias the moment the orders began moving. "You humiliated my mother before enemies," she hissed. "You refused me before every court in the spiral. And now you stand on our throne steps giving commands as if you were born above us." Elias folded one map, then another. "No princess. I stand here because everyone born above you is trying to save their own ceiling." She stepped closer, blade still in hand. "You think me a trinket? I think you are angry because someone finally refused to let your value be measured by who possesses you. Serenity froze. The words cut too cleanly. He softened his voice by a fraction. Your mother is afraid. You are afraid. That is not shameful. But if you spend the next hour defending your pride, Graxhall will spend it killing people who do not know your name. Sorellin's grip on the blade tightened until her knuckles shone pale blue. For one breath, she looked young beneath the jewels. Painfully young, then she sheathed the blade and asked, "Where do you need me?" That was the first time the princess chose command over insult. Elias sent Cerelia to the lower city, not because it was safe, but because the people needed to see someone royal descend while noble elevators locked above them. She went in armor silk with 6 guards, then dismissed 4 when Elias said 2 guards could move faster through panic. The lower city was nothing like the palace murals. It smelled of engine oil, old rain, crowded kitchens, and fear. Towers rose into darkness beneath the capital shield, with bridges stitched between them and market lights trembling under the shadow of the carven dreadnought. When citizens saw Seralini, some knelt, some cursed, many simply begged. She had been taught petitions in clean halls, not from mothers pressing babies into her arms, not from miners asking which child should take the last thermal mask, not from old workers who could not climb evacuation ladders and apologized for being heavy. Her first instinct was to promise everything. Her second, taught by Elias in one brutal sentence, was to count. She counted masks, stretchers, broken doors, fuel cells, panic routes, and the number of people royal policy had hidden beneath glorious architecture. Through the Ilias's voice stayed calm. "Princess, report Shelter 7. She answered, overcrowded by 3,000. "Furnace weak, East Gate jammed," he said. "Break the jewelry kiosks. Use display crystals as heat lenses. Send strong walkers to Shelter 9. Keep families together unless crush pressure rises." She snapped, "I know how to move people," he answered. "Then move them." "Not your dignity," she almost cursed him, then saw a child staring at her crown with terror, as if gold itself had come to decide who lived. Cerilini pulled the crown from her hair and handed it to an old mechanic. "Can this focus heat?" The mechanic blinked, then laughed once. "Wild and bright, Highness. Your crown is ugly as a furnace part, but yes." Within minutes, the crown of First Dawn, worn by 12 queens, was hanging inside a cracked heat column, scattering warmth over hundreds of shivering civilians. Cerilini watched her reflection break into light across their faces and felt something in her training begin to burn away. Above, Queen Valora fought a different battle. The noble council had turned from insult to sabotage. Because no class surrenders priority without mistaking justice for theft, Duke Avareth claimed his transports were contaminated. Lady Vera hid fuel codes behind religious exemption. 3 minor princes attempted to launch private escape yachts from the northern spire. Elias handled them without drawing a weapon, which made him more frightening. He asked for manifests, passenger counts, maintenance logs, debt records, and oath clauses. Every dull instrument nobles despised until it opened their skins. Avareth's contaminated transports were found loaded with statues. Vera's sacred fuel reserve had been purchased with public famine tax. The prince's yachts carried empty banquet tables, while children froze below. Queen Valora watched Elias expose her court with paper, witnesses, and arithmetic, and each revelation aged her more than the war outside. At last she whispered, "I thought I ruled them," Elias said. "You inherited their obedience and ceremony, Majesty, not their loyalty in crisis. That must be built differently." Graxel grew impatient. His dreadnought fired not at the palace, but at the western weather anchors. Sending a shockwave through the capital shield, snow began falling inside the lower city. Impossible snow. Glittering through machine light while alarms screamed, thousands looked upward and saw death becoming beautiful. Cerilini was on Bridge 12 when the cold hit. Carrying a fevered boy because his mother had collapsed, her guards shouted for her to retreat. But the bridge crowd surged, pinning families against railings. She called Elias, Bridge 12 failing. "Too many too cold? Need heat," Elias answered. Ceremonial flame towers are opening. 2 minutes. She looked at the bridge struts cracking under frost. We do not have 2 minutes. The line went quiet, then he said, "Sing the old anthem," she shouted back. "This is not a pageant," he said. "The old anthem has marching cadence. People know where to step. Use it, princess, now." So Cyrilliane sang badly at first, because royal voices were trained for halls, not terror. But the first line of the Luminara Dawn anthem carried across the bridge. And old citizens answered from memory, then workers, then children, then guards. Thousands stepping to rhythm instead of panic. The bridge stopped shaking under chaotic force. Crowds began moving in waves, and when the flame towers finally opened, heat burst upward in red spirals, turning snow to rain. Cyrilliane held the fevered boy and sang until her throat hurt, while people who had never seen the palace except from below sang back to her as if she belonged to them, not above them, with them, when the last group crossed. Bridge 12 broke behind them, falling into darkness with no one on it. She sat on the ground among strangers and realized the human had used a song as engineering. The crown he refused was beginning to change hands without touching his head. The Carven attack shifted at midnight. Graxol realized the capital would not break fast enough, so he sent raider pods toward the lower domes. Insectal craft carrying breach charges and harvest squads, Dominion fighters launched to intercept. But half the fleet was still guarding noble orbital stations by outdated protocol. General Orakash demanded permission to abandon evacuation cover and engage in full battle. Elias refused on the Queen's behalf. Orakash bristled. "You are not our king, human," Elias answered, "correct? So stop asking me for permission to spend lives that belong to your queen." The general turned to Valora, whose face was pale but steady. She said, "Civilian cover remains first priority." Orakash bowed, ashamed that he needed the command spoken twice. The first raider pods punched through outer fire and landed in market districts where Cyrilliane had just moved refugees. The princess drew her blade, ready at last for a clean enemy she could strike. But Elias's voice came again. "Princess, do not chase them. Mark them, herd people." "Not raiders," she snarled. "They are killing my citizens," he said. "They want you to become a warrior while the crowd loses its commander." She looked at the civilians around her, saw fear turning toward her blade. Waiting for royalty to choose spectacle and lowered it, that choice hurt. It felt like cowardice for 3 breaths. Then strategy for the 4th, she ordered lantern drones released. Not as weapons, but as markers. Every raider position painted in blue light for fighters above. She pulled civilians into furnace shelters, sealed side alleys, put musicians at tunnel mouths to keep movement in rhythm, sent old mechanics to disable lifts behind the enemy, and turned market awnings into camouflage nets. The raiders found no dense crowds to harvest, only empty streets. False heat signatures, trapped corridors, and blue light blooming over their armor before Dominion snipers and Terran relief drones disabled them one by one. Cyrilliane did kill one raider who broke into Shelter 9, but even then, she did it silently, quickly, without announcement, then went back to carrying water. Because the dead raider did not need her pride, and the living did. By dawn, the lower city had not fallen, and the palace nobles had lost the moral argument of centuries in a single night. Graxhol's next transmission came at sunrise. His face filled every remaining screen. Colder now, amusement stripped away, he addressed Elias directly. "Human, I offered this queen death, she offered you empire, and you took neither. What are you?" Elias stood in the throne hall with blood on his collar from carrying wounded through a stair collapse. Maps spread around him, Queen Valora seated behind him, not as ornament, but as exhausted command. Serlin's live reports flickering from below, he answered. "A citizen of a species that learned crowns make poor helmets?" Graxol leaned closer. "You could rule them." "They are broken enough to accept it," Elias said. "Broken people do not need another owner. They need time, food, shelter, law, and enemies who learn consequence." The overlord smiled again. Consequence, yes, at that word. Carven ships fired on the eastern refugee corridor. Not enough to destroy it, enough to show they could. Thousands died in a line of white light, and the throne hall shook with the sound of names vanishing. Queen Valera covered her mouth. Serelini screamed through the cum. Elias closed his eyes once when he opened them. The room understood why Earth had sent a man without a crown. Asterisk, he said, Majesty. Invoke the Civitas Clause. The Queen looked up. Horror and confusion mixing, that is a civilian protection treaty. Earth never ratified it with the Dominion. Elias removed a sealed black chip from his prosthetic wrist and placed it in her hand. Earth ratified it before I landed. Conditional on your consent. She stared at the chip. What does it do? He answered. It makes every attack on evacuation corridors an attack on Earth-protected civilians. It gives Earth legal authority to intervene without claiming your throne, your fleets, or your daughter. The nobles erupted again, but weakly now. Like insects after winter, Valara's fingers closed around the chip. Why did you not reveal this when I offered you the crown? Elias looked at her. Because you needed to choose protection without purchase. Or it would only be Empire, wearing Earth's face. The Queen's eyes filled, not with royal tears, but with the grief of a mother who had nearly sold her child because no one had taught her help could arrive unbought. Valora pressed the chip into the treaty altar, and the hall lights changed from gold to blue. Far above, beyond the atmosphere, space folded open in quiet lines. Terran ships emerged without banners, without trumpets. Without the arrogant beauty of conquerors, they came matte gray and practical. Hospital arcs first, then evacuation carriers. Shield barges, drone foundries. And finally, the long, dark silhouettes of defense cruisers whose weapons remained cold until the civilian registry synced. The Carven fleet reeled. Not because Earth outnumbered them, though perhaps it did, but because Earth arrived in the wrong order for conquest. Hospitals before guns. Shelters before admirals, proof before threat. A Terran admiral appeared on every channel. Admiral Nio Okonkwo, calm as winter water, Carven host. You have fired on protected evacuation corridors under ratified Civitas authority. Power down engines, submit to boarding, and prepare for war crime seizure. Graxel laughed. You declare war over refugees? Admiral Okonkwo answered. No, Overlord, you did. The first Terran shields fell around the lower city like sunrise made solid. Carven bombardment struck those shields and shattered into harmless auroras. Serelini stood below as blue light covered the shelters, and for the first time in months, people stopped running, not because danger was gone, but because someone stronger had finally placed themselves between death and the poor without asking what titles they carried. Terran hospital dropships landed in markets. Medics pouring out with portable furnaces, trauma foam, translators, and the brisk impatience of people who considered survival a logistical problem rather than a miracle. Seraline found herself working beside them. Stripped of crown, sleeves torn, face smeared with soot, handing tools to a human medic who called her Sira because the translator failed at royal honorifics. She almost corrected him, then laughed instead. There were still raids, still fires, still bodies beneath collapsed corridors, but something had shifted. The Carven were no longer writing the shape of the day, and the Dominion was no longer waiting for permission to save itself. In orbit, the battle began with silence. Terran defense cruisers did not charge. They placed themselves around civilian routes, inviting the Carven to waste ammunition against shields while drone swarms mapped weapon ports. Dominion ships, once scattered by noble protocol, reformed under Orikash's corrected orders, no longer guarding private estates but escorting evacuation lanes. Graxel tried to punch through toward the palace, believing the Queen's capture would still end resistance, and found Earth had left the palace deliberately less guarded than the hospitals. Because Elias had predicted the ego of a crowned predator, Carven boarding claws latched onto the upper spires. Harvest troops pouring into corridors of gold and crystal. The nobles screamed for protection. Some even fled toward the lower levels they had ignored. Queen Valora rose from the throne, took a guard's sidearm, and looked at Elias. I am no soldier. He said, No, Majesty, you are a queen. They are attacking your house because they think houses matter more than people. Prove them wrong in the direction you choose. Valora ordered the palace opened, not sealed. Every civilian still outside was brought through royal gates. Every banquet hall became triage, every treasure vault became shelter. Every ancestral tapestry was cut for blankets. The carven troops who expected an empty symbol found a living city inside the palace. Servants guiding children through throne corridors, priests carrying oxygen tanks, nobles forced at guard point to haul water. And Queen Valora herself, standing at the main stair with a pistol she barely knew how to hold. Cyrilline arrived through the lower lifts with smoke trailing her. Saw her mother armed and shaken, and ran to her. For 1 second, they were only mother and daughter. Then the first breach door exploded inward, carven warriors surged through, and Elias stepped between them and the stair with a fire axe taken from an emergency cabinet. Not as king, not as suitor, not as conqueror. Only as the nearest person who could stand, he had refused the crown, but not the duty people mistook crowns for. The fight in the palace was ugly, close, and brief. Because the defenders did not fight for honor, they fought for seconds. Elias broke the first raider's knee with the flat of the axe, turned the second into the third, shoved a royal table across the marble to block a plasma line, and shouted for Cyrilline to take the left corridor. She obeyed without anger, leading a mixed group of guards, servants, and terrified nobles into a flanking passage. Queen Valora fired 3 shots, missed twice, hit once, and looked astonished by both the recoil and her own survival. The carven pressed upward, trying to seize the throne room, but the palace architecture had been built for ceremony, not assault. And Elias used every stupid golden staircase against them. Cutting chandeliers, flooding polished floors, dropping curtain weights, rerouting service lifts, turning the grandest palace in the spiral into a trap made from vanity. Terran Marines arrived 7 minutes later, not because the royal family was valuable, but because the palace was full of civilians now, and that distinction had become the heart of everything. Graxel boarded personally when the first assault failed. Because humiliation demands witnesses, he came through the broken eastern window in black armor. Surrounded by his honor guard, his bone crown gleaming beneath burning sky, he found Elias at the foot of the throne. Bleeding from one cheek, axe broken, prosthetic left hand sparking, Queen Valora behind him with refugees, Cyrilline beside him with her blade out, and nobles huddled among commoners in the corners. The overlord laughed. Human, still no crown, still no bride. Still standing in places that will not belong to you. Elias dropped the broken axe. They belong to the people behind me. Graxel drew a massive sword. Then die as their servant, Cyrilline moved. But Elias lifted his damaged prosthetic hand, not stopping her by force, just asking. She hesitated. Hatred burning in her eyes, he said, "Protect the stairs." The princess wanted the duel, wanted the clean strike, wanted revenge for the corridor. But below the stairs children were moving, wounded were crawling, and her mother could not cover both sides. Cyrilline turned away from glory and held the stairs. The overlord frowned. Because humans had a terrible habit of ruining theater. Graxel attacked, and Elias did not meet strength with strength. He met it with time, retreating half steps, turning cuts into misses, giving ground only where refugees had already moved. Using throne fragments, fallen spears, shield flashes. And the overlords need to be seen? He could have died in the first minute if Graxel had fought simply. But tyrants rarely fight simply when an audience is available. They decorate murder with speeches. And Elias survived inside each sentence. He bled, stumbled, rolled beneath a strike that cracked the floor. Came up with a shield projector torn from a fallen guard, and slammed it against Graxel's sword. Not to block, but to overload the blade's edge. The explosion threw both of them apart. Elias hit the steps hard, his prosthetic hand skidding across the floor half detached. Cyrilline screamed his name. Graxel rose first. Laughing, magnificent, terrible, exactly the image he wanted recorded forever. Then the palace screens behind him lit with live feeds from the lower city. Not of fear, but of evacuation. Continuing, hospitals working. Dominion and Terran crews saving lives while he postured? Elias looked up at him and said, "You lost when they stopped watching you." Graxel turned and saw the truth. His fleet was retreating from shield corridors. His raider pods were pinned by joint rescue militias. His dreadnought was surrounded by Terran cruisers with boarding locks already attached. And across the Dominion, citizens were not kneeling to terror. They were moving, carrying, repairing, naming the dead, saving the living, refusing to become the audience his power required. Overlord Graxel. Admiral Okonkwo's voice came over the speakers. "Your flagship is disabled. Your command codes are captured. Your harvest ledgers are public. You may surrender to trial, or remain standing until your armor battery ends." Graxel roared and charged Elias, not strategically, not even murderously, but theatrically. Needing one final image, Cyrilini intercepted him, not with a killing strike, but by cutting the strap that held his bone crown to his armor. The crown fell, clattered down the steps, and was caught by a little refugee boy who stared at it in confusion. Then threw it into a medical waste bin. The hall burst into a shocked laugh that became a roar. That laugh broke Graxel more completely than a blade could have. The Overlord lunged after the crown. Elias swept his leg with a broken spear shaft. Cyrilini drove her shoulder into his armor. Queen Valora fired the last charge of her pistol into the ceiling above him, dropping a curtain cable that tangled his sword arm, and 3 Terran Marines landed on him like gravity made angry. Graxel fell not beneath a prince or queen or chosen champion, but beneath a tired human, a crownless princess, a shaking mother, and soldiers whose names no song had learned yet. He was bound alive, because Elias insisted, because trials could starve legends where executions often fed them. When Graxel spat that Earth would claim the Dominion anyway, Elias knelt beside him and said, "Earth does not need your stolen habits." That was when Queen Valora, covered in dust and blood, looked at the broken throne behind her, then at the refugees sleeping beneath royal banners, and understood that her first offer had been the last reflex of a dying empire. The battle ended in pieces, as battles truly do, not with one trumpet, but with scattered reports. This corridor secured, that child found, this fire contained, that ship surrendered, this body identified, that family reunited. The Carven fleet withdrew under Terran escort toward tribunal space. The harvest ledgers opened across 1,000 networks, and the Dominion learned the size of its own wound by reading names instead of casualty estimates. Elias spent the next 30 hours refusing medical care until Cyrilini threatened to assign 4 royal poets to narrate his stubbornness in public. He submitted to treatment immediately, which made the human medics laugh and the princess feel a victory sharper than any duel. Queen Valora visited him in a side chamber that had once stored ceremonial masks and now held field beds. She came without crown, and for the first time he saw her not as a monarch offering bargains, but as an exhausted woman whose empire had taught her fear and royal grammar. She said, "I owe you an apology," Elias replied. "You owe your daughter one first." Valora flinched, not from insult, but from truth. Cyrilini stood in the doorway and heard it. Neither entering nor fleeing, the queen turned, eyes bright with shame. "I tried to spend you because I thought that was what queens do when kingdoms burn." Cyrilin's face stayed proud, but her voice cracked. "I was ready to be spent because I thought that was what daughters do." Elias looked away, giving them privacy by pretending to inspect a bandage. Valora crossed the room and took Cyrilin's hands. "Not as queen to heir, but mother to daughter. No crown is worth that." She whispered, "Not ours, not Earth's. Not any crown in any sky." Cyrilini lowered her head into her mother's shoulder. And for one fragile moment, the Dominion's future stopped being a treaty object and became a family learning how not to devour itself. The formal assembly met 3 days later in the ruined throne hall. Sunlight entering through patched windows, medical cables still running along the walls. Noble seats rearranged to make room for city delegates. Miners, shelter captains, refugee coordinators, and Terran legal observers. The old court hated the new arrangement, which recommended it immediately. Queen Valora rose before them all, holding the crown of First Dawn, warped from its service as a heat lens. No longer perfect, no longer ceremonial, she looked at Elias, who stood to the side with his left arm in a sling and his prosthetic being repaired on a table by a board engineer. "Commander Mar," she said, "I offered you my daughter and my throne as payment for salvation. You refused, before all houses and all citizens. I ask again, not as purchase, not as surrender, but as invitation. Will Earth accept protectorate authority over Luminara until Reconstruction ends?" Elias felt the old court leaned forward, eager to be ruled by distant power if it preserved their local privilege. He shook his head. No, this time the refusal did not shock Serenity. It made her smile. Valora waited, because now she understood refusal could be a beginning. Elias said, "Earth will provide aid. Defense coordination, war crimes prosecution, reconstruction engineers, medical support, and debt relief frameworks, but authority remains with the people of Luminara and whatever lawful reforms they choose. A protectorate would teach your nobles to obey a new master instead of answering to those they failed." The queen nodded slowly. "Then what would you have us do?" Elias looked toward the lower city delegates, asked them. The two words struck the hall with terrifying simplicity. Some nobles scoffed, but softer than before. Because their transports had been seized, their lives recorded, and their survival witnessed by servants carrying stretchers, Valora turned from the throne toward the delegates, a movement small enough for etiquette, vast enough for history, and asked, "What does the capital need first?" An old mechanic stood, the same one who had hung Sorellin's crown in the furnace, and said, "Heat before statues, majesty, food before victory arches, courts before revenge, names before numbers." The queen bowed her head. "It shall be entered." Reform did not descend like light. It arrived like repair, noisy, slow, inconvenient. Full of arguments and invoices, noble rescue privilege was abolished. Shelter infrastructure placed above palace beautification. Military command tied to civilian protection protocols. Royal marriage treaties revised to require the consent of every person named inside them. And the crown of First Dawn, warped and smoke-stained, was mounted not above the throne, but in the lower city heat hall. Where school children could see the day royalty became useful, Sorali took charge of reconstruction routes, not because it was glamorous, but because she knew bridges now, knew crowd rhythm, knew the smell of cold metal before failure. She argued with Elias daily for 6 weeks over ration priority, hospital placement, noble amnesty, prisoner trials, and whether humans were constitutionally incapable of resting. He argued back with maps, numbers, witness statements, and that unbearable calm that made victory against him feel like losing to a wall built for your own safety. One evening, months after Graxel's capture, Seralini found him in the heat hall below the city. Standing before the warped crown as children chased each other around furnace pipes, he wore civilian clothes now, his repaired prosthetic uncovered. Metal fingers flexing with a faint click, she asked, "Do you regret refusing me?" It was the boldest question left between them, and the quietest. Elias did not insult her with quickness. He looked at the crown, then at the children warmed by it. "I regret the world that made you think refusal was humiliation." Serenity folded her arms. "That is not an answer. It is the truest one I have." She stepped beside him. "I hated you for it, I know." "I thought you saw me as unworthy," he turned then. Finally meeting her not as princess, not as treaty, but as person, Seralini. "I refuse because you are not a door Earth gets to open into power. You are not a ribbon around a treaty. You are not your mother's last coin, or your court's prettiest surrender." She looked away because tears were easier to hide in furnace glow. "And if I chose you now, not crown, not treaty, not empire, just me." Elias was silent for a long time, then he said, "Then I would ask whether you are choosing me, or the first man who gave you back yourself." She hated him a little for that too, but more gently. That was the legacy of the crown he refused. A princess no longer willing to be offered, years later. After the trials had named the dead, and the lower city had rebuilt its bridges, Serali found Elias on Bridge 12, rebuilt now in white alloy, and worker glass. The city glowed below, alive honestly, not perfectly. And she stood beside him without a crown, wearing a reconstruction jacket over royal clothes. "I am not offering you a throne," she said. Elias answered too quickly. "Good," she laughed. "I am not offering myself as payment. Better. I am asking whether you will walk with me tomorrow. No envoys, no queens, no treaties, just the lower markets, terrible tea. And mechanics who still insult my crown?" Elias looked at her. And because the choice belonged to no empire, number mother, no court, it became more precious than ceremony. "Yes," he said. No herald recorded that yes, but Cyrilline kept it like a sovereign country inside her chest, because the first free answer of her life had been given freely back. Years later, when scholars argued about the siege of Luminara, some said Earth saved the Dominion through military power. Others said Queen Valora saved it by consent. Others said Princess Cyrilline saved it by descending to the lower city, and all of them were partly right. But the oldest survivors always corrected the young in the same way. They said salvation began before the ships, before the shields, before the battle and the throne hall. It began when the queen offered everything the old universe valued: daughter, crown, empire, ownership, obedience, and the human said no. Not from contempt, not from weakness, not because the prize was too small, but because humanity at its best had learned that the right to help must never become the right to possess. They said he refused the crown, and in doing so, taught a queen to rule, a princess to choose, a court to answer, and an empire to become worthy of rescue. And beneath the rebuilt palace, where the warped crown of first dawn still warmed the public hall, children would point to it and ask why the most sacred crown in the Dominion was not on a royal head. Their teachers would smile and say, because once, when the city froze, a princess took it off and made it useful. Because once, when a queen tried to buy salvation, a human refused to sell it. Because once, in the hour when every empire expected Earth to take power, Earth sent someone strong enough to leave power in the hands of those who had to learn how to carry it. And if the children asked whether the human ever became king, the teachers gave the answer Cyrilline loved most: no. He became something far harder for tyrants to understand. He became trusted.